You are asking for the keys. On Radical Promises, Democratic Consent, and Why Slogans Are Not a Governing Program, by Elias Winter, August 22, 2026. Read by an automated voice. There is a political genre I have come to distrust. It begins with an invitation to imagine. Imagine waking up without debt. Imagine never worrying about a medical bill. Imagine housing guaranteed as a right. Imagine working fewer hours. Imagine retirement secured by the public. Imagine food, energy, medicine, education, and transportation no longer organized around profit. This is more or less how the Democratic Socialists of America opened their 2026 program, Workers Deserve More. In their Day Without Capitalism, the future is secure, humane, materially generous, and liberated from many of the humiliations that define ordinary American life. The same program then moves into much larger territory. A 32-hour work week with full pay, universal rent control, public ownership of the largest corporations and essential industries, abolition of the Senate, replacement of the presidency and Supreme Court with institutions subordinate to Congress, and steps toward fully abolishing the police and prison system. I have to admit something. Much of the first paragraph sounds lovely. I would also like a balcony. The problem begins when the movement moves from describing the life it wants to describing the authority it needs. At that point, I am no longer reading a healthcare proposal. I am being shown plans for another constitutional and economic order. Except they are not really plans, they are more like watercolor renderings of the lobby. This is the problem I want to discuss, not socialism itself, not whether capitalism is sacred, not whether the existing order deserves preservation merely because we inherited it. It does not. I support universal health care. I support substantially higher taxes on extreme wealth. I support reducing the ability of concentrated money to purchase political power. None of those convictions requires me to pretend that a movement proposing to redesign the state has explained itself merely because it has chosen morally attractive nouns. A democratic movement asking citizens to delegate power owes them information proportional to the power being requested. The burden of specification should rise with four things: magnitude, discretion, coercion, and irreversibility. The larger the change, the more discretion officials will exercise, the more coercive authority will be required, and the harder the change will be to undo, the more citizens deserve to know in advance. If you are asking to repaint the kitchen, I do not need structural drawings. If you are asking to remove 2 load-bearing walls, replace the electrical system, transfer ownership of the building, rewrite the deed, and move the staircase, I would like considerably more than a vision statement. America is the building. You are asking for the keys. 1. The burden of specificity. No political program can answer everything in advance. That would be absurd. Legislation changes during negotiation. Agencies write regulations, courts intervene, economic conditions move, coalitions fracture, unexpected events occur. Nobody proposing a modest adjustment to a tax credit needs to arrive at a campaign rally carrying appendices on Treasury enforcement procedure. But the amount of tolerable ambiguity should decline as the amount of delegated power increases. A proposal to change a tax rate leaves most of the constitutional and economic order intact. A proposal to alter the ownership structure of the largest corporations does not. A proposal to reduce incarceration can be debated through sentencing law, prison policy, and rehabilitation. A proposal to abolish police and prisons eventually has to tell us which institutions will exercise coercive authority instead. A proposal to improve Congress is one thing. a proposal to abolish the Senate, replace the presidency, subordinate the judiciary to Congress, and draft a new constitution is another. This is not because radical ideas are automatically illegitimate. Some radical changes are necessary. It is because the democratic stakes are different when the action is difficult to reverse after power has been transferred. You vote before the machinery exists. Then the movement wins. Then the machinery gets designed. Perhaps you like what emerges. Perhaps you do not. But by then, the people interpreting the mandate possess the authority to act. This is the danger concealed inside the phrase, "We will work out the details democratically." When? Before the election? Excellent. Afterward? Less comforting. The problem with "we'll work out the details later" is that later is usually after you have the power. And once political actors possess power, they become remarkably imaginative about what voters authorized. Details are not bureaucratic decoration. They are how democratic consent becomes meaningful. 2. The coalition needs the vagueness. Take one of the largest promises in the DSA program: public ownership of the largest corporations and essential industries. Which corporations? What counts as large? Market capitalization? Revenue? Employment? Market share? Strategic importance? Who owns them legally? The Treasury? A sovereign wealth fund? Workers? States? Citizens individually? A new federal holding corporation? Who appoints the board? Can an administration remove management? Can Congress direct capital expenditure? Can the company issue debt? Can it acquire competitors? Can it close an unproductive division? Can it move production? Who receives the profits? What happens to existing shareholders? Are they compensated? At what price? What happens to pension funds and retirement accounts holding the shares? These are not hostile questions. They are what ownership means. And DSA's own discussion of the program makes the ambiguity unusually revealing. One of the people involved in drafting it explained that public ownership had been left broad enough to hold together different currents inside the organization's big tent. Different factions may imagine different institutional arrangements when they read the same phrase. That is politically convenient. It is also exactly the problem. Public ownership can mean direct state ownership. It can mean social wealth funds. It can mean worker ownership. It can mean municipal ownership in selected sectors. It can mean something closer to extremely heavy regulation of nominally private firms. Those are not versions of the same mechanism. They distribute power differently. They distribute risk differently. They create different incentives. They create different opportunities for corruption. They fail differently. This is where ambiguity becomes useful to a coalition. Details divide people. Everyone can agree on economic democracy. The fight begins when someone asks who appoints the board. Everyone can applaud public ownership. The fight begins when someone asks whether a retiree's shares are bought, seized, converted, or left alone. Everyone can agree that concentrated private power is dangerous. The coalition becomes less serene when someone asks precisely how much concentrated public power will replace it. Abstract language allows factions to stand under the same banner while imagining different institutions. That may be useful for movement building. It is not sufficient for democratic authorization. A movement's internal need for ideological harmony is not a substitute for the citizens' need to know what the movement intends to do with power. Suppressing disagreement does not create unity. It postpones the argument until after the election. That is not democratic depth. It is constructive ambiguity with a ballot attached. 3. The left has excellent demolition verbs. Then we reach the part of the activist left that I find considerably harder to take seriously. It has developed an extraordinary command of demolition verbs: defund, abolish, dismantle, decommodify, decolonize. The vocabulary for construction remains noticeably smaller. There was a glorious period in American politics when apparently every failing institution could be repaired by adding D to something. Nobody ever seemed to propose debugging it. The police and prison plank is where the problem becomes clearest. DSA's current program does not merely call for ending mass incarceration or reducing police violence. It calls for steps toward fully abolishing the police and prison system. There is a serious abolitionist intellectual tradition. That should be said plainly. Abolitionist thinkers have proposed restorative justice, transformative justice, alternative emergency response, mental health systems, violence prevention, rehabilitation, and different approaches to confinement or incapacitation. The problem is not that nobody has thought about the question. The problem is that the answers differ substantially, and the slogan does not tell the voter which one is being authorized. A murder occurs. Who investigates it? Who collects forensic evidence? Who obtains the warrant? Who arrests the suspect? Who is legally authorized to use force if the suspect refuses? Who takes down an organized criminal network? Who responds when someone is shooting people? If prisons are abolished, what happens to someone who repeatedly commits serious violence? Perhaps the answer is a secure, rehabilitative institution. Fine. Can he leave? If not, who orders the confinement? For how long? Under what evidentiary standard? Who reviews it? Who protects the confined person against abuse? At some point, if an institution can arrest you, physically restrain you, and keep you in a secure building you cannot leave, we may discover that changing the noun did less work than anticipated. I am not asking for the font on the new stationery. I am asking who has lawful authority to arrest someone. And there is something almost impressive about returning to this vocabulary after 2020. The activist left watched defund the police become politically toxic. It watched politicians who did not even support the slogan get forced to answer for it. It watched opponents define entire coalitions by their most maximalist activists. The obvious lesson might have been that slogans involving the deliberate reduction of public safety institutions require extraordinary explanatory care. Instead, 6 years later, the official program of the country's largest socialist organization contains the phrase, "fully abolishing the police and prison system." Apparently, the branding problem was insufficient boldness. This is not political courage by itself. Courage would mean persuading millions of skeptical people that a specific alternative institution would protect them better. Abolition without institutional specification is easier. It announces that the speaker has crossed the moral threshold. It communicates seriousness inside the subculture. The administrative consequences can be discussed after the panel. This is a recurring pathology of activist politics. The most politically serious person in the room can become the person making the claim least constrained by the need to govern anyone outside it. Reform the police. Not enough. Defund them. Still compromised. Abolish them. Now we are getting somewhere. The policy frontier becomes a status frontier. At that point, asking what happens after abolition begins to look like a failure of imagination rather than the beginning of governing. But the person outside the activist subculture does not experience armed robbery as a failure of imagination. He would like to know whom he calls. 4. We have already tried. Governing by ambiguity. None of this is uniquely left-wing. The American right recently demonstrated exactly why citizens should distrust ambitious movements that keep the relationship between campaign language and governing machinery obscure. During the 2024 campaign, Donald Trump repeatedly distanced himself from Project 2025. He denied that it was his governing program and pushed back against attempts to tie him to it, even though the project involved people from his broader political orbit. After he won, his administration pursued policies that overlapped with, and in some cases went beyond, substantial parts of that agenda. People associated with the project entered the administration. The lesson is not that DSA and Trump are morally equivalent. The lesson is about method. Before an election, ambiguity is politically useful. After an election, ambiguity becomes governing discretion. That is why citizens should demand specificity, while they still possess the leverage to withhold the keys. If the right wants mass deportation, show the machinery. Who is deported? Through what process? With what detention capacity? At what cost? Under what judicial review? If the right wants to dismantle federal agencies, name the agencies. Name the functions. Explain who inherits them. If the left wants public ownership, explain ownership. If it wants abolition, explain coercion. If it wants to replace central constitutional institutions, show the replacement constitution. No movement gets a vagueness exemption because its intentions are righteous. That is exactly when the exemption becomes dangerous. 5. A country governed by vibes. The depressing question is why movements can get away with this. The answer is not merely that politicians are dishonest. It is that much of the public no longer rewards policy seriousness. We increasingly consume politics the way we consume influencers. Who sounds authentic? Who knows whom to hate? Who humiliates the right people? Who can summarize an entire civilization's moral pathology in 90 seconds? Who has the clip? Who has the podcast? Who has the aesthetic? The politician says the system is broken. Correct. The influencer tells you who broke it. Excellent. The video ends. You now possess an enemy and a tote bag. The harder questions perform badly. Which agency administers this? What statutory authority does it have? What does it cost? Who appoints the governing board? What happens to existing contracts? How long is the transition? What happens if the revenue estimate is wrong? Who loses from the policy? What happens if the new bureaucracy is corrupt? The algorithm has not yet discovered a mass audience for administrative law, so our political system increasingly rewards people who can perform political recognition while remaining strangely empty on administration. They know the wound. They know the villain. They know the approved analogy. They know the vocabulary of moral seriousness. Then somebody asks, who administers the pension fund? Suddenly the answer is democracy. The campaign website has become mood lighting. And I do think this reflects a failure of citizenship. Not because ordinary people need graduate degrees in public policy. They do not. People have jobs, children, parents, rent, medical appointments, and refrigerators that begin making a strange noise 3 months after the warranty expires. But a functioning republic requires citizens to possess an appetite for a small set of boring questions. How? Who? How much? Under what authority? Who can remove them? What happens during the transition? What happens if the policy fails? What happens if the people administering it become corrupt? What power are you asking me to give you? What limits will remain on that power? These are not boring questions. They are the sound citizenship makes when it is awake. A population that votes primarily on influencer vibes will eventually receive influencers who happen to control the state. That is a considerably less amusing version of TikTok. 6. A revolutionary with a podcast. There is a distinction between an activist and a governing movement. An activist can name a direction. A government must build an institution. An influencer can say housing is a human right. A government has to decide who builds the housing, who owns it, who receives it, how much it costs, who maintains it, and what happens when 10,000 people want 5,000 apartments. An influencer can say billionaire power must end. A government has to write tax law, campaign finance law, lobbying rules, disclosure requirements, enforcement provisions, and constitutional arguments. An influencer can say democratize the economy. A government has to explain ownership, voting rights, capital formation, bankruptcy, fiduciary duties, investment, procurement, and enforcement. An influencer can say abolish prisons. A government has to decide what happens to the man who committed 3 murders yesterday. A revolutionary with a podcast is still applying for a government job. And government is different because government can compel. It taxes, it regulates, it seizes property pursuant to law, it restricts liberty, it licenses, it punishes, it sends armed agents, it sends soldiers. That is why the amount of ambiguity we tolerate should decline as the amount of power requested rises. Magnitude matters. Discretion matters. Coercion matters. Irreversibility matters. The more of those you are asking me to accept, the more detail you owe me before the election. Not infinite detail. Enough to know what I am authorizing. The strange thing is that modern political movements frequently operate in exactly the opposite direction. The larger the proposal, the more lyrical the language becomes. Details are dangerous because details divide people. Economic democracy is beautiful. Who controls investment? Now we have a fight. Community safety is beautiful. Who arrests the armed robber? Fight. Public ownership is beautiful. What happens to the shareholder? Fight. A new democracy is beautiful. Who appoints the executive? Fight. Of course, the coalition prefers the beautiful noun. The ugly verb threatens unity. But government is where the beautiful noun meets the ugly verb. Democracy encounters appointment. Justice encounters allocation. Equality encounters scarcity. Solidarity encounters taxation. Public ownership encounters management. Abolition encounters the violent offender. Sooner or later, someone has to decide. I would like to know who before I vote. 7. 3 things before utopia. My own agenda is embarrassingly small by revolutionary standards. I would like everyone to have health care. I would like extreme wealth to purchase much less political power. I would like people with very high incomes and enormous fortunes to pay substantially more taxes. This is apparently the modest position now. 3 tasks. None of them is remotely easy. Universal health care would require defeating or restructuring some of the most powerful industries in America, building financing machinery, coordinating federal and state systems, handling millions of employment transitions, negotiating drug prices, setting reimbursement rates, and maintaining political legitimacy through the inevitable failures of implementation. Reducing the political power of concentrated wealth would require dealing with campaign finance, dark money, lobbying, revolving doors, media power, philanthropy, litigation, foundations, think tanks, and every other place money migrates when one channel is blocked. Taxing extreme wealth more heavily would require valuation rules, enforcement capacity, treatment of capital gains, trusts, inheritance, avoidance strategies, capital mobility, and the army of lawyers wealthy people can hire to explain why ownership technically ceased to exist on Tuesday afternoon. These are not centrist errands, they are enormous political projects. So here is my proposal to people who would also like to reconstruct corporate ownership, abolish prisons, abolish the Senate, replace the presidency, subordinate the judiciary, redesign labor relations, and write a new constitution. Show me some governing capacity. I have seen group projects with narrower scope. This does not mean those 3 reforms must happen before every deeper change. A socialist can reasonably argue that existing institutions are precisely what prevent major reforms from succeeding. Perhaps concentrated wealth will always defeat attempts to weaken concentrated wealth. Perhaps the constitutional structure itself blocks democratic majorities. Perhaps you cannot repair the bathroom because the foundation really is broken. Fine. Then show me the foundation. Show me exactly how it prevents the repair. And, more importantly, show me the replacement design. The argument that the foundation is broken does not reduce your burden of detail. It increases it. There is a strange grandeur in proposing to redesign civilization before demonstrating that you can deliver universal health care. It is like announcing plans for a moon colony because the dishwasher remains difficult. And yes, perhaps the dishwasher genuinely cannot be repaired because the entire electrical system is defective. Then bring an electrician, not another slogan. The point is not, do my 3 reforms before yours. The point is that a movement should demonstrate governing capacity where mechanisms can be substantially specified before asking citizens to authorize transformations whose mechanisms remain contested inside its own coalition. If you cannot renovate the bathroom, I become cautious when you announce plans to move the foundation. And if the foundation really is the problem, bring the structural drawings. 8. Bring the blueprints. Bring the blueprints. Politics needs imagination. Without it, injustice acquires the dignity of tradition. Every institution we inhabit was invented by human beings and can therefore be altered by human beings. Markets are institutions. Corporations are institutions. Property law is an institution. Police departments are institutions. Constitutions are institutions. Nothing is sacred because it exists. So dream. Imagine universal security. Imagine stronger workers. Imagine a political system less easily purchased by billionaires. Imagine a justice system less brutal than the one we have. Imagine different ownership structures. Imagine a more democratic constitution. Then do the part political influencers increasingly seem to regard as beneath them. Explain it. Tell me which institution disappears and which institution replaces it. Tell me who appoints the people running it. Tell me what happens to existing property. Tell me what happens to the pensioner. Tell me what happens to the worker displaced during transition. Tell me what happens to the murderer. Tell me how much the system costs. Tell me who pays. Tell me what happens when the revenue assumptions are wrong. Tell me how I remove incompetent administrators. Tell me how corruption is investigated. Tell me what powers you require. And tell me what powers you promise not to use. I do not distrust these movements because they dream too large. I distrust political movements that confuse the size of the dream with evidence of their capacity to administer it. I distrust people who propose abolishing institutions they cannot yet describe replacing. I distrust coalitions that preserve unity by postponing their most consequential disagreements until after voters have transferred power. And I especially distrust a political culture in which asking what exactly happens next is treated as a failure of imagination. We have already spent years voting for people who sell identities and improvise governments afterward. I see no reason to reproduce the model merely because the influencers have changed. You want the keys? Bring the blueprints. Not the slogan, not the live stream, not the moral vocabulary, not another declaration that everything must be abolished, dismantled, decommodified, democratized, or transformed. Show me the institution. Show me the law. Show me the budget. Show me who has power. Show me how I remove them. Show me what happens when you are wrong. Then ask for the keys. Elias Winter, author of Language Matters, a space for reflection on language, power, and decline.